This voting machine was first purchased and used by the city of Minneapolis in 1909. As far as we know, it may be one of the last in existence. On the back of this device, there are instructions for what to do before a woman enters the booth. You would pull a lever and it would block her from anything that wasn't a school or library board election. Standing in front of it, you can imagine yourself being a female voter in 1910 and what it must have felt like to watch an election judge go to the back of the machine and pull a lever, making it impossible for you to do what should be a right for you as a citizen. That piece is what kind of takes people's breath away because it makes it real and it puts them in that point in time.
The challenge was to get the right to vote for women, which is the most fundamental right you can have in a democracy.
Now's the time to rouse yourself, spend the strength you save.
Suffrage is symbolic of these larger women's rights issues. It became the political tool for achieving the issues that these women were very interested in tackling.
They organized, publicly put themselves on the line, and over and over and over again faced defeat, ridicule, harassment, and they stuck to their guns.
This claim on citizenship, voting as the most essential act of a citizen who is equal.
Hi, do you know about Super Tuesday?
Kind of.
I'm tabling for the primary election for the presidential election day, and it's Super Tuesday, so you could exercise your right for voting. There is many issues as a young woman in Minnesota matters for me. Coming from Yemen, I'm not a U.S. citizen, so I don't have the right to vote. So we have the 2 ballots. I really wish I could vote, and knowing that I could do small thing by educating people and helping them to understand the importance of voting, that's like the least thing that I could do for like this community and this society, because women fought for us to have this right, and we need to celebrate every single day by getting out to vote.
Up until the 1870s, women didn't have the right to own their own property.
Because they were considered property of their husband, and if they went to work outside the home, their wages belonged to their husband.
Single women, widowed women had a bit more right to their property, to their wages, things like that. But your husband was entitled to beat you and do just about anything he wanted to you.
If they could get divorced, the children also belonged to their husband.
Literally people believed that educating women would damage their reproductive organs.
Women didn't have access to higher education. They couldn't borrow money without their husband signing for it. And that continued until 1974.
Women couldn't serve on juries. They couldn't make the laws, but they had to pay the taxes.
And the women who did enter the public arena as factory workers and traders, and who were already working in the fields as slaves, in some ways they were defined out of the category. They were failed women.
And that also tells you what a difficult battle women had ahead of them, because when you don't acknowledge that someone is deserving of those rights in the sense of citizenship, we really couldn't accept the idea of women voting.
I mean, you really aren't a citizen unless you can vote.
It was unthinkable for a woman to enter the public arena and vote.
Most historians of women take the origin of the suffrage movement back to a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft, who is a British woman who came out with a book in the 1790s, Vindication of the Rights of Women. It's a call for women's education.
It didn't occur to any of those founding fathers that women were citizens in the same way that men were citizens. In fact, not all men were citizens in the way that those white, wealthy men were.
But the purpose of the nation was for citizenship to be for land-owning white men.
Right at the beginning, a problem was posed if being a citizen is critical to being the nation that we are trying to create. What is a woman? Is she a citizen or isn't she?
An early step into public life, agency, and activism was participating in religious movements, which called many women, black and white, to the effort of ending American slavery.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were involved in the abolition movement. They were offended when they went to London to an anti-slavery convention that they were not accepted as equal partners in this struggle, and that really began their recognition that maybe women needed to have their own movement. The first real written demand for the vote was at Seneca Falls in 1848, but the first real articulation of the wide array of rights that women were thinking about, the vote was the most radical of those.
This spirit of women's liberation moved west as these women and their families settled on the prairie. Founding teacher Harriet Bishop and crusading journalist Jane Grey Swisselm were among these early educated women's rights advocates.
Territorial Minnesota was called the New England of the West for good reason, and the New Englanders that migrated here, they were looking for more from life, from finishing schools to colleges, and women were just starting to be accepted in coeducational institutions.
It's my deep belief that education is fundamentally subversive. If people learn to think for themselves, then they can analyze the world around them. And they can also imagine other possibilities.
Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton would later recognize the women's suffrage pioneers in Minnesota.
Minnesota is remarkable for its galaxy of superior women, actively engaged as speakers and writers in many reforms. One of the great advantages of pioneer life is she acquires a degree of self-reliance, courage, and independence, and commands a degree of respect from the men at her side that can only be learned in their mutual dependence. Mrs. Stearns has done very much to stir the women of the state to thought and action upon the question of women's enfranchisement.
Sarah Berger Stearns had attended a suffrage convention as a teenager. The emergent activist led a group of young women who pressured the University of Michigan to admit women in the 1850s. Sarah married Ozora Stearns, a white officer commanding U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. Sarah taught African Americans in freedmen's schools where her husband was stationed and offered other support for Union troops. In 1866, the Stearns settled in Rochester, Minnesota.
She's part of that first wave of suffragists. All these early lessons that she learned, the power of writing and the power of speaking out, the power of petitioning, the power of bringing a group of women together. She pulls all of those together, and she founds one of the first suffrage associations in the state in Rochester. She moves up to Duluth, and she does the same thing all over again. She founds a suffrage club.
Sarah started the Duluth Suffrage Society. Her work in the Zenith City was wide-ranging and included forming a home for women needing, quote, a place for rest, self-help, and self-protection, sounding a lot like a women's shelter, which might make it the first shelter in the state.
And I think that's important to remember about all of our suffragists. Rarely were they involved in only one cause. Usually these are women who are embedded in their communities and working on a number of causes simultaneously. And clearly they're seeing the link. And they're seeing that suffrage is a way that they can advance all of their other work.
In 1868, Minnesota's founding suffragists pushed a petition to strike male from election language in the state constitution. The effort didn't result in any legislation. That same year, Minnesota made history by giving Black men the right to vote.
When you get the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendment, those were measures for limited citizenship. So all of this is to make sure that wealthy white men are the citizens.
When the 15th Amendment was first proposed as an amendment that would give Black men the right to vote,
Black women are excited about that because they have something with Black men that political scientists refer to called as linked fate. And what linked fate is it means that it's either your dad, your husband, or your son. And so there is a vested interest in Black women getting the vote with Black men.
Women involved in the suffrage struggle are asking for the amendment to include women. There is a significant push to get the amendment changed to have that happen. That fails. And when that fails, there are a lot of recriminations.
And most people don't realize it originally was going to be the 16th Amendment because the Black men got it with the 15th. The white women said, okay, we're next.
Then we see sort of the outbreak of what probably has been simmering under the surface all along, and that is the sense of privilege that white women have.
And a lot of white women were really upset by this because what you would have is like white women from these, aristocratic families who'd say, you're letting this Black man who wasn't even a human being 3 years ago vote. And so you have that kind of tension.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony make statements that are really just virulently racist.
This is certainly the case in Minnesota, and not just a white movement in the way that we think about whiteness today, but really a US-born, Anglo-Saxon Protestant movement. Very few Catholics, very few immigrants, very few members of the Black community were brought into the fold of this early suffrage movement in Minnesota.
The African American freedom struggle and the fight for women's rights coexisted within one visionary leader who Susan B. Anthony would later call the rock upon which Minnesota's suffrage movement was built.
The person who is ahead of the times pays the penalty for being radical, until such radicalism is accepted by the people as conservative.
Julia B. Nelson, I think, is a great example of a person whose really long career in women's rights expands over all these different ways that we see the movement mature and change in response to the different kinds of social and political issues that were afoot in American culture.
Julia B. Nelson is such an interesting figure because she really did seem to see the idea of freedom as being intersectional.
She also was a big advocate for women's rights and women's suffrage, not from the perspective of keeping the home intact, but from the perspective of empowering women. She argued for the vote because she believed that women needed to have equal rights and not be bound to the home. In that way, she was really a progressive leader.
Julia Bullard Nelson, she was born to Connecticut Yankees. She came to Minnesota Territory in 1857. She was 15 years old, and she almost immediately enrolled in Hamline University. And Julia was one of the first people in Minnesota to get an official teaching degree. She had met a young man at Hamline, Ole Nelson, and Ole enlisted in the Union Army.
The couple had a baby boy named Cyrus, but the baby died in infancy. More tragedy followed when Ole, sickened during the war, passed away just months later.
So there she is, 26 years old, and clearly a huge turning point. Where do I go from here? The Civil War is over. Freedmen need education, and they're not going to be getting it from Southern teachers. She joined a missionary group who would go south and teach freed black slaves.
So, in the fall of 1869, Julia B. Nelson boarded the steamboat War Eagle for her trip south.
She's down at the Red Wing Levee, getting on a steamboat, and a hymn rises from the crowd, and it's kind of funereal. It's very solemn. She's going to the South. They don't know she's coming back.
Heading into the realm of the recently defeated Confederacy, Julia B. faced down the malevolent presence of the Ku Klux Klan, which was contrasted by the warm reception of her students and their community.
The colored people of Hallettsville sent an ambulance for us, and we started for that place and reached there the same night without molestation from Ku Klux. We got up a fine evening exhibition among the colored children, and the next day they had a parade and barbecue. We took a Union flag with us. I made arrangements to have 2 Northern teachers come to teach the colored children under the Free School Act. The rebels don't like that much, for they like to keep the Yankees out.
She had the black community at her back. Frederick Douglass had written to her, they were communicating, and he said, I know it's a sacrifice, but we need people like you to go back.
We have enrolled over 400 pupils since opening the free school last September. Of these, over 100 who did not know the alphabet when they entered now read quite well. As many more who did not know the written letters now write, and those who are pursuing arithmetic, geography, and grammar are making steady advancement. The colored youth of this place would soon compare favorably with any young people anywhere.
Julia was home in Minnesota during the summer. She works on the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and Suffrage equally.
The temperance movement of the late 1800s really started in the 1870s. Women across the East Coast and Minnesota and parts of the Midwest were doing what was called women's crusades. They were going to bars and they were praying and singing songs outside of saloons. And they were basically trying to convince people that it was morally superior to drink less, which sounds very stodgy and stiff. But women actually had a lot of reasons to be very nervous about the amount of alcohol that was being consumed.
And the reason why they were vested in temperance was because they were concerned that their husbands were going out and getting drunk, coming home and beating them, and there's no recourse.
Many women weren't working outside the home, and so men were the primary breadwinner, and they would be spending a lot of their paycheck at the saloons. So it really was a serious issue. And so these temperance leaders, many of them began arguing for women's right to vote in a very conservative way. They framed their movement specifically as home protection. So they were looking to protect the home in a very heteronormative sense of the family structure.
The Women's Christian Temperance Union became the largest organization of women by the end of the 19th century, and it taught a lot of women how to be political.
Women started to branch out in creating different activist paths and different ways of achieving their goals. Education, as we start to see public education being strengthened. These women wanted to make sure that their children had access to education, that the education was quality.
Following the lead of other states, suffragists in Minnesota took aim at the right to vote on school-related elections. And this time, they put it to the voters to decide.
It was a highly gendered enterprise because, they would say, I'm raising children. Therefore, I claim authority to speak on things that affect my children. And then we see them claiming more political, civic, and social territory. And then once they occupy that space, they are able to use it to expand their sphere even more.
After being made official in the legislature, Minnesota women could vote on school board elections in 1876, the centennial year of the nation. That year, Charlotte Winchell and pioneer Charlotte Van Cleve were elected as school directors in Minneapolis.
This is a common pattern around the country that women were able to win either school board rights or rights to vote in primary elections, but women in Minnesota had not been able to achieve anything more despite a lot of attempts.
The next phase in the fight for the vote grew directly out of the fight against alcohol.
1881, there's a women's Christian temperance union meeting, and at that meeting, a small group of women breaks off and they decide we're going to form a separate organization specifically to argue for women's right to vote. It was called the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. This association argues specifically for the ballot. And while some of them were still arguing in this sort of home protection model, many of them did end up taking a much more explicitly equal rights stance, saying that the vote was needed to advance women's rights. And that was pretty new and pretty progressive.
While there would be many suffrage societies, clubs, and organizations in the decades that followed, this entity would be the through line for Minnesota women's fight for the vote and full citizenship, closely adhering to the direction of their national parent organization.
It's important to talk about who they were and who they weren't, because these movements from the founding were much more open to white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant women. They were open to wealthy women, which means they were not working class women. Oftentimes, they were US-born WASP women. And those movements didn't necessarily do very much to bring women who didn't meet those criteria into the fold.
In 1883, the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association held their annual meeting in Minneapolis. The event was convened by the newly elected president of the Suffrage Association and newly arrived Minnesotan, Dr. Martha Ripley. Martha Rogers Ripley grew up in Iowa, where her farmer father was involved in the Underground Railroad. As a teen, she volunteered on Civil War efforts and then began teaching. After finishing medical school, a 40-year-old Ripley and her husband moved to Minneapolis, where she began her practice as one of Minnesota's first female physicians. Her focus was on obstetrics and safe childbirth. She herself was a mother of 3. She quickly was elected president of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association, in part because of the recommendation of national leader Lucy Stone. Dr. Ripley said her duty was to not keep silent when wrong exists. Among the many misogynistic wrongs in Minnesota was legal latitude for the mistreatment of girls.
It sounds hideous today, but I want to bring it up. Age of consent, meaning in those days when sexual activity with a girl was allowed, and that would be allowed through matrimony, but it had been 10.
The age of consent in Minnesota was 10. Dr. Ripley attempted to change that. The state legislature pushed back and reaffirmed men's control over girls. Ripley described Minnesota's statutes as worthy of the dark ages. Dr. Ripley fought to move the age to 18, but had to settle for 14 as the age of consent. In her frustration, and where she saw her vote as her voice, she personally petitioned the legislature for the vote, which was said to have been met with laughter and ridicule. Another grim reality of life for women in the 19th century were the high levels of mortality during childbirth. But another arcane policy of the era was that unmarried women could not be admitted to hospitals to give birth. In 1886, Dr. Ripley rented a small home and opened the maternity hospital, which would serve poor women and other marginalized women and their babies for over half a century. Years later, and on her deathbed, it is said that the last words spoken by Dr. Martha Ripley were, "Is everything all right at the hospital?" In the early 1890s, Julia B. Nelson was back in leadership. now president of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association and back at the Capitol, once again pushing for an amendment to strike the word male from the voting language in the state's constitution.
Every single session, she had some form of suffrage law before the House, and they rarely got out of committee. Like 1891, she wanted municipal suffrage. Women could vote in municipal elections. Well, no, they couldn't. That didn't go. So she moved on to such things as women taxpayers. If you're a taxpayer, shouldn't you be able to vote?
Women should either have all the privileges of citizens or be exempt from all the burdens of citizenship, and if they are to be sheltered and protected, let those who stand alone and unrepresented be sheltered from the tax collector.
Working with leading lawmaker Ignatius Donnelly, the Suffrage Association was gaining ground. One senator who had opposed a woman's right to vote had been swayed by their relentless activism. As he described it, "The good sisters have gone down into my district and overwhelmed me with petitions. I will therefore vote yes." The effort won by a wide margin in the Senate, but the clock ran out in the House, and the session ended with the amendment lost to time. The passage of time must have been suffocating to suffragists. They had already been on this path for half a century, some of these women having spent their entire adult lives working and waiting for the franchise. But there were weapons other than time being used against the vote for women.
Ridicule is a very, very effective tool, and we see this in cartoons in the magazines, editorials in the newspapers.
Hyenas in petticoats, right? The screeching sisterhood. There's a whole series of insults. The imagery that's used to depict suffragists is often of these harried, emaciated, bespectacled, unfeminine, monstrous women.
So there were closed-minded men and stereotyping media, but opposition also included other women.
The leader of the local anti-suffrage movement was a woman named Lavinia Coppett-Gilfillan. She had a number of reasons that she thought women shouldn't have the right to vote, most of which stemmed from this overarching theme across the country in that the traditional roles of men and women would be upset.
And they had to fight other women along the way because if we remember the Gilded Age and the wealthy matrons, they were the ones who loved the way things were going, and they saw women as ornaments.
Yet another obstacle was the early connection between women's suffrage and temperance, which was a threat to the way of life to the considerable population of German immigrants in Minnesota in the late 19th century.
Most temperance leaders didn't really make an effort to reach out to new immigrant communities, to working class communities. A lot of these communities were making a living in the alcohol industry.
So when a suffrage organization and a temperance organization were connected, that was like a double negative for German immigrants.
When organizers like Julia Nelson meet a woman or her husband who simply says, we don't agree, you might see them as backwards. Julia Nelson and some of the other early suffragists began adopting strategy which was not one based in the idea of sisterhood, but it was based in the idea of class politics and Anglo-American nativist politics.
Along with internal strife and the ongoing racism and xenophobia among suffragists, the movement was also starting to lose its original activists. One of Minnesota's founding mothers of the movement, Sarah Berger Stearns, died in 1904.
Right about that time, there was a real stagnation in Minnesota in the suffrage movement. They have to reinvent themselves.
In 1901, the National Women's Suffrage Association held their annual meeting at the First Baptist Church in downtown Minneapolis. Susan B. Anthony struck a hopeful note and acknowledged the North Star State's role in the movement.
I have been to Minneapolis before. I have been to almost every city in the Union, and I'm glad to be here. Glad for all that has happened, and glad for all of the members we have gained.
It was a new century, and there was new leadership emerging in Minnesota's women's suffrage movement. And the upbeat outlook at the gathering inspired one Minnesota woman to deepen her involvement in the decades-old March for the Vote.
If I can be, in any small way, instrumental in gaining the franchise for the women of Minnesota, I shall feel that I have been allowed to be of real use.
Clara Ueland comes to suffrage very late. She has 8 kids, and she doesn't necessarily have the time to be getting involved in the suffrage movement while she's raising the kids. But even as she was raising children, she was really living according to some pretty progressive, what we would now call feminist ideologies.
The wife of successful lawyer and Norwegian immigrant Andreas Ueland, Clara's civic leadership grew out of gatherings at their landmark home on Bottineau Baldwin.
She was used to advocacy. She was used to using her social connections to advance the greater good. She came so late to the movement, and many sources say it was through her daughter, which I just love that. I can just imagine the dinner table conversations, because from what we know of the Ueland family, they debated, they talked.
By the late 19th century, there were enough women coming out of colleges and yearning for some way to continue the intellectual sparks that they had enjoyed. They formed clubs. These clubs were by the thousands in little towns as well as big cities, and they started organizing themselves. They also were coming of an age when women had created institutions like settlement houses that were designed to meet social needs, particularly those of women and children. They may have been middle class and educated, but they went to the settlement house and saw the world through different eyes. So Clara Ueland and Carrie Chapman Catt, what they learned was a sort of on-the-ground politics of organizing. And they're beginning to develop an agenda that became known as progressivism that said government should have something to do with meeting all of these social needs. They became politically active and politically influential even before they had the vote.
In addition to being a founding member of the Minneapolis Women's Club, Clara Ueland was also a member of the Scandinavian Women's Suffrage Association, which was a driving force for the movement despite the anti-immigrant tendencies of the mainstream.
The Scandinavian Women's Suffrage Association said, actually, we are representative of the best kind of American immigrants that you want to see. We have a heritage of democracy that we have from our countries, and we want to bring those values to help improve America and show how we are participating in a really great Americanization project. They claimed their ethnic identity in a way that was different from the way I think NASA wanted to erase those kinds of ethnic identities.
The white women's suffrage movement, in order to gain support for their movement, they had to look to other communities who were doing suffrage organizing within their own communities.
Among the diverse women's rights activists was Fanny Flegelman Bryn, a Jewish immigrant, University of Minnesota graduate and peace activist, and an African-American suffragist who would help bridge the cultural divides in Minnesota's movement.
Nellie Francis. She always knew who she was. And that kind of grace, I think, really brought people to her to lead. And because of her physical features being non-traditionally African, she was able to move back and forth between two different races, between black and white race. And she graduated from St. Paul Central, one of the first African Americans to graduate from there. She delivered a speech called The Race Problem, where she was saying things about race relations and racism that even the black leaders of St. Paul were not really saying.
It cannot be denied that the Negroes be accorded the same rights and privileges as other people and given the same opportunities. May the people of this country, North and South, East and West, early awake to the sense of their duty in this manner and thoroughly realize that the race problem must be settled right. And then can all black and white, American and foreign born, shout with one glad shout that shall sound and resound from pole to pole and from sunrise to sunset. This is the land of the free.
She was very powerful as a speaker. The reporters and the editors who saw the speech, those commentaries all reflect the same message, that she moved hearts. I think that characterizes Nellie Francis on the broad stage of politics and race relations.
Nellie Griswold married emerging lawyer and leader William T. Francis. Over the years, her civil rights work was wide-ranging, with women's suffrage being one of the many movements she was engaged in.
She is very active in Pilgrim Baptist Church in St. Paul, and really a focal point, a hub of Black community organizing at this time in the late 18 and early 1900s.
Nellie Francis wanted to have a suffrage club, a politically organized club that focused on the issues of African American women.
Every Woman's Suffrage Club. The name says it all. She was very much interested in bridging the races, bringing the races together.
Clara Ueland connects with the Every Woman Suffrage Club, and she connects with Miss Francis. And what Clara Ueland demonstrated is that you need to listen to the communities that are already doing this work, who haven't been a part of your movement thus far because they've been excluded from it.
When I look at what are Native people in the Great Lakes or in Minnesota doing during the suffrage era, we were also facing the aftermath of that big dispossession that the allotment policies had caused that called for the breakup of tribal lands in the early 20th century. There was a new poverty that Ojibwe people were experiencing, and Native children are going off to government boarding schools. Really tremendous problems that Native people are facing, because what Native people were supposed to get in exchange for all the losses they'd suffered in terms of their land was citizenship. For the vast number of Native people, when we think of the suffrage era, we weren't citizens of the United States. My grandfather, who was in World War I, was not a citizen of the United States.
While not formally citizens of the United States, Indigenous women had always played crucial roles as tribal leaders.
For Ojibwe people, formal politics was predominantly the role of men, but women were really in control of the economy. And so I think the way we've come to understand the way men and women worked was, I think the term we use is complementarity, that there was a kind of equality.
This cultural tradition of equity and involvement gave Native women a unique perspective and thrust transcendent suffragists from tribal communities into the foreground of the movement.
A Dakota woman named Zakala Shah, who was also known as Gertrude Bonnin, and she was a Yankton woman who was very outspoken about Native people gaining citizenship. And she was part of an organization that formed in 1911 in the United States called the Society of American Indians.
In 1916, the Society of American Indians met in the Midwest. This would be a homecoming for one of its most notable members. Marie Bottineau Baldwin was one of the first Native American women in the U.S. to graduate from law school. She worked in Washington, D.C. with the Office of Indian Affairs.
She was from the Turtle Mountain community in North Dakota. I tend to place her with this interesting generation of people who were active in the Indian service and who held jobs in Washington, Native activists and writers in the early 20th century.
The Turtle Mountain Ojibwe band member had Minnesota roots. She attended high school in Minneapolis where, as the daughter of a pioneer family and lawyer J.B. Bottineau, she was a person of note. Described as highly educated, Bottineau Baldwin is said to have pursued a legal career to advocate for her people. During her long tenure in the Office of Indian Affairs, she navigated the two worlds she inhabited, one of American politics and policy, the other of her tribe and traditions. The bicultural bearing would also show up in her suffrage work. In the build-up to the dramatic suffrage parade of 1912, she was asked by organizers to create a float invoking Native themes. She pushed back on what might have felt like a cliched and contrived concept.
I have not yet decided whether to obey the request of the parade rangers or not. As for the Indian women, they have had virtual suffrage, also the power of recall, since time immemorial.
The parade took place on March 3rd, the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. Some 5,000 people marched down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Thousands of women were marching. They were led by Inez Milholland, a beautiful woman on a white horse with a flowing cape. They were into spectacle, and everybody went to watch and then to harass.
Particularly in the early 1900s, as it still is now, a woman's body is a site, is a location of public opinion. And the accusation of women who do go in public and do go in the street, the accusation thrown at them is always going to be that they're prostitutes. And that was something that suffragists endured.
They were pulling women out and beating them up. And downtown Washington had turned into a riot. But that was a breakthrough, because suddenly masses of women were not going to behave in a decorous way anymore.
Marie Baldwin ultimately refused the segregated and stereotyped plan to represent Indigenous women. Instead, she, like Ida B. Wells Barnett, marched alongside white women. The parades of the 1910s were dramatic, performative protests, and one of the many ways suffragists used creative expression as a weapon of choice.
Suffragists were actually great at using the arts for their cause. They did ballets, they did plays, they did skating carnivals, they did all sorts of things to that end.
Banners were a really important part of the suffrage movement overall.
Purple signified dignity, honor. White is purity, and gold is energy and vivacity.
Women were not meant to have a voice in public. So how do you have a voice in public and still be womanly? Well, you sew something, and you let your sewing literally speak for you.
In 1914, this strategy of spectacle was on display in Minnesota as a parade of thousands marched on Minneapolis. But for some of the pioneers of social justice in Minnesota, this would be the last glimpse of the movement. Charlotte Van Cleve, Harriet Bishop, Jane Grey Swisshelm, many of the pioneers of women's rights had passed away. Dr. Martha Ripley died in 1912. Julia B. Nelson was able to see the movement she helped found march down the streets of Minneapolis. But a few months later, on the day after Christmas of 1914, Julia Bullard Nelson passed away.
The founders of the movement died before they realized their goals, but women kept at it. Like they found the energy to keep going.
This energy took on a more radical tone, fueled by Alice Paul's direct action in the late teens. And in Minnesota, Clara Ueland and other mainstream leaders' appetite for agitation was tested as one of their own was on the front lines of this militancy.
Bertha Moeller is a great example of a woman who is awakened during this movement. She joined the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association and became quite active as a speaker and particularly as a recruiter around the state. She would head into a town, put up posters, put up banners, and then do the speaking herself or host other speakers who would come into town. She was passionate about this work. She grew more and more passionate and more interested over time. in the National Woman's Party, the more radical arm, led by Alice Paul.
Alice Paul's National Women's Party attracted young activists like Bertha Moeller to join the work in Washington. But once again, the radicals and the moderates fought over how to proceed. This time because the U.S. was entering the fight to make the world safe for democracy.
When World War I started, the question was, should we set this aside for now and work for the war, or should we keep fighting for it? The National American Women's Suffrage Association pulled out all the stops to organize the home front, get women to go to work outside the home, to roll bandages. Alice Paul's position is, we can't step back.
Rather than rolling bandages, they were going to continue to picket. And not only just picket, but picket the White House and chain themselves to Woodrow Wilson's back fence, and then hold banners which accused him of being the Kaiser.
Women were pelted with rotten eggs and tomatoes, that they were dragged through the streets. A woman who would go to a town and give a talk would be treated like a dancing dog. She'd get a crowd laughing and jeering, but they did that over and over and over again. It took a lot.
Bertha ended up saying, you know, it's time for me to go to Washington. So she went to D.C. She participated in marches. She was arrested, of course. She ended up in jail a number of times. And that was the point at which then Clara Ueland wrote a letter to the membership saying, you know, Mrs. Moeller is no longer representative of our ideals.
The objection to picketing came when the arrest started. And this again tells you something about how the drive for the vote was wound up completely with women's status. Because to go to jail as a woman at this time was a disaster. Your reputation gone. And a woman's reputation at this time was everything that she had. There are 7 women from Minnesota who end up participating in the picketing and being arrested. Sarah Colvin is involved with the most controversial demonstration that Alice Paul ever staged, and that was the demonstration which burned Wilson in effigy. Many people thought a step too far. They were given the choice of paying a fine or going to jail. And the women almost always chose to go to jail, and this is because of the attention it would get. The women who were in there for any length of time, many of them decided to go on a hunger strike in order to protest the fact that they were not accorded the privileges of political prisoners.
So one group is keeping the issue in the headlines. The other group is using their organizational capacity to support the war effort in ways that Woodrow Wilson knew were extremely effective. He knew at the end of the war that he owed them. And that, I don't think Woodrow Wilson thought women should vote, but I do think he knew he owed women. Alice Paul then begins to drive pressure to ratify the federal amendment instead of state by state by state. And that lifts it to a new level. Mostly, it began to feel inevitable to a whole lot of women, and I think enough women were persuading the men in their lives that this just had to be. This was a sharing of power. And normally, people with power don't just give it away.
The Senate passes the 19th Amendment through their House successfully. They immediately press Governor Burnquist to call a special session. On September 8th, the Minnesota legislature meets, and in an hour and a half, they have ratified the 19th Amendment.
Minnesota was the 15th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. 36 states were needed, and after all the other southern states rejected the amendment, it fell to the last state to vote, Tennessee.
Harry Burns was newly elected to the Tennessee State House. He was on record as saying he was going to oppose. But the classic story is that his mother wrote him a letter the night before telling him to do the right thing. And he switches his vote, and it's ratified by Tennessee by one vote. And that was enough to push it over the edge.
On August 26th, 1920, and that is the official date that the 19th Amendment becomes law.
It took George Washington 6 years to rectify men's grievances by war, but it took 72 years to establish women's rights by law. At least 1,000 legal enactments were necessary, and every one was a struggle against ignorant opposition. Women's suffrage is a long story of hard work and heartache, crowned by victory.
Minnesota has a special role to play because on August 27th in South St. Paul, there is a bond issue. Even though a bond issue is a pretty basic thing to vote on, women have never had the right to vote on bond issues. And in South St. Paul, women begin to line up to vote because of the day before's ratification. Minnesota holds the honor of having the first women to vote under the auspices of the 19th Amendment.
For every Clara Ueland, there are probably 24 people whose names we may never know, who are working at the grassroots level.
The Midwest and the Great Plains were absolutely instrumental to creating suffrage leaders that really enrich what our full democratic heritage is.
With the power of the ballot, Minnesota women began harnessing the power of elected office. In 1922, 4 women won seats in the state legislature, and activists like Clara Ueland and Nellie Griswold Francis continued to leverage the power of their hard-won influence.
Clara Ueland, for example, went on to really push against exploitative child labor practices. The Every Woman Suffrage Club morphed into the Every Woman Progressive Council, and Nellie Francis became very active in the anti-lynching movement.
Nellie Francis became the chief lobbyist for the first anti-lynching law in the country, here in Minnesota, in the aftermath of that horrible lynching in Duluth in 1920.
Before and in the aftermath of women's suffrage, women like Nellie Francis, who worked within their communities and broader communities to fight for change, even when at the polls, there was still rampant racial discrimination. It still took another 45 years for there to be efforts to ease racial bias at the polls. And it isn't until 1965 that the Voting Rights Act is passed. 45 years after women's suffrage is implemented across the US, and 45 years is like a voting lifetime for some people.
The struggle for gender equity would continue. Women would experience progress and backlash in the century since 1920. Focus remained on the themes and issues that drove the early suffragists: children and education, health and safety, equality and civil rights, citizenship, with new voices joining the generational women's march.
And you're gonna make sure you can identify the source, you're gonna figure
I
out
tell people all the time that it is impossible to be pessimistic about the future teaching at my campus, that I am inspired by my students.
What should you do today? Vote. And I just want to review. We'll pack up in just 30 seconds and then we'll walk to the voter van.
In my classes, when we would come to suffrage, I needed to communicate to my students how many generations worked to get this.
For me personally, as a Latina, I feel like it's my first time voting, and I feel like I would represent a lot of people who can't vote, and I feel like that's really important for me.
Democracy isn't real until we're all there. It just isn't real. Freedom doesn't mean anything for one group if it doesn't apply to everybody. All of these freedoms which have been hard-won, all of these efforts to make our Declaration of Independence statement that all men are created equal actually mean all people. That is something we cannot take for granted. And if we don't exercise those rights, it's as if they're not there.